One of Cadix's claims about this new Walksnail Ascent VRX Pro is that it offers lower latency than previous versions of the Walksnail Ascent video system. And when I did my review, I did a single latency test. That latency test produced numbers that were a little bit higher than some people expected. And in fact, if you compare my results to Madstech's results, his were lower than mine. Today, I'm going to take a look at that. I'm going to explain why it happened, and I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into how we can get the latency of the system as low as possible. To put all this into perspective, here are Madstech's results. I'm showing his video on screen so you can go watch it if you're interested in the full details. But he found that the lowest latency was around 31 milliseconds to first pixel, 35 milliseconds average, and 44 milliseconds to full frame, which is pretty consistent with what the device shows on screen when it's reporting its own latency. There are several things about his testing that affect his numbers and are different than mine. One of those things is that those results were at the 120 frame per second frame rate. He used a 120 FPS gaming monitor. I don't have one of those, and I think most people flying FPV aren't going to be flying off a 120 FPS gaming monitor. So currently there is no practical way for a typical FPV pilot to actually achieve these numbers. That's all theoretical until there is a goggle in existence that can display a 120 FPS HDMI feed. And surprise, surprise, Walksnail is working on such a thing, although who knows when they'll actually release it. Don't hold your breath. It'll be nice when it happens. The closest test that Madstech did to the test that I put in my review of this system is this one, I believe, 720p 60 Ascent Lite Plus with VRX Pro. The difference being that he's using the Goggles X and I'm using the HD0 Goggles 2. The HD0 Goggles V2 has been specifically optimized to have the lowest possible latency on its HDMI pipeline. The latency is 1 millisecond for the HDMI input plus another between 0 milliseconds to first pixel and 1 frame time. So at 60 frames per second, that would be 16 milliseconds, and at 100 frames per second, that would be 10 milliseconds. And we can see the reason for that here. Here is the HD0 screen, and as the light starts to light up, you can see it starts to light up and then slowly, frame by frame, scrolls down the screen. The reason we're seeing it scroll down the screen is that we're capturing at 240 frames per second, but the screen is running at 60 frames per second. So it takes 4 240 frame per second frames for one 60 frame per second frame to fill the screen. And the way it works is, in this case, it started at the top of the screen, but that's not actually necessarily always going to be the case. Hold on, here we go. Here's an example of where it starts in the middle of the screen and scrolls down and then rolls around to the top. So what's happening is that there is essentially a scan line going down the screen and back up to the top. It's not literally an electron beam like there used to be with the old CRT TVs, but that's how the HDMI feed reads out, one scan line at a time. And so wherever that scan line happens to be, when the frame starts to come in, that's where the screen will start to update. That'll be your first pixel, and that takes 1 millisecond. And then, so this is like 1 millisecond later, and then 1 frame time later. So for 60 frames per second, that's 16 milliseconds, you get the full screen. So the latency that you measure depends on whether you're trying to measure first pixel, in which case the HD0 goggles would add 1 millisecond, or full frame, in which case it's 16 milliseconds for 60 FPS, or 10 milliseconds for 100 frames per second. So if we look at Madstech's numbers, and again, this is the Goggles X, it's not the Goggles 2. I don't see him reporting 720p 60 on the Goggles 2. He gets 39 milliseconds for the first frame, 49 for the average, and 65 for the full frame. Now, I can't compare that directly because what I'm doing with my app, because I don't want to do all this stuff by hand, is I'm measuring when the screen gets brighter. Okay, so when the screen gets brighter, basically halfway through this process, we will trigger and detect a transition. So I can't give you the min and I can't give you the full frame, but I can give you the average, and I got an average of 53.1. If we know that the full frame is 16, then the average is half that. That's going to be 8 plus 1 for the HDMI input. That's roughly 9 milliseconds pipeline latency inside the goggles. So if we take 53 minus 9, we get 44. But the key thing is that roughly lines up with the number that we're seeing down at the bottom of the screen for the VRX. And that's, I think, the takeaway from this. The number that we're seeing at the bottom of the screen for the VRX is the FPV system latency, and then you have to add the display latency to that in order to get the actual full latency of the system. Okay, with that being said, I also tested the 100 frame per second lowest latency settings. I didn't do that in my original review because for some reason I didn't seem to have the 100 FPS option, but this time I did. I don't know where it came from, or I really think I checked for it. I don't know. In addition to setting it to 100 FPS, which reduces the latency, I also changed a couple settings. If you turn focus mode off, if you turn 3D noise reduction, 3D NR off, and you make sure you're set to low latency, which I was, that reduces the latency as low as possible according to Cadex, and here's the result. With those settings, I got an average of 40 milliseconds of latency. And again, if you subtract about 9 milliseconds for the HD0 goggles themselves, that actually gives you a pretty freaking impressive number. And well, you can decide for yourself whether that's flyable. If you're interested in this app, I will be making a video telling you more about this app and how you can get access to it. I will put a link to the GitHub repo. It's public. I'll put a link to the GitHub repo down in the video description below. It's not quite ready to be announced. I'm still working on it. But if you're doing this kind of testing, this app is pretty interesting, pretty useful. And I'll put a link to my original Cadex Ascent video as well as Matt's text video in the video description below.